get you to help me with a book. Nobody should write a book. It's a big mistake. I've committed this mistake several times. This is the first one. This is a book about what it was like to be the FCC chairman in the salad days of the internet. And that is a book that nobody read this book either, but this is really an accurate book. And it has a great cover, I think you'll agree. That came out in 2006. And this book, which came out in 2012, was an ebook that you could get for like a penny or something like that from Amazon. This book was also not read by anybody and was completely right, particularly about the budget. Just thought I'd point that out. And this book came out last year. This is a book about clean energy, and this is also an ebook, very, very cheap. It's a big mistake to have worked on these things. Took a huge amount of time, and I'm making the same mistake for the last time with this book, which hasn't been written yet. And so what I'm doing today is I'm going to tell you about the book, and I'm going to ask you in the question and answer to illuminate to me all of the silly things that you can perceive right away. I guess I should ask. I guess I should confess. Why am I writing this? I'm writing this because I, by luck, was part of two transition teams. These groups of people that get together at the request of the person nominated to be president. The person gets elected, then your transition team morphs into a job fair where everybody on your team tries to get a job in the government. I was part of the Clinton Gore transition team in 92, 93, and then part of the Obama transition team when he looked so cheerful and young in 2008, 2009. They both were quite different as experiences, partly because I was much different in age and experience in the two circumstances, and I had gone to law school with Bill Clinton and to high school with Al Gore, so there was there were a lot of social relationships then, and I had known Barack since 2003, which for him was an ancient relationship at that time, but I didn't know him in the same personal way that I knew the others. So that was a difference. But there were tremendous similarities, and I thought that I would try to figure out what I really thought about these two experiences, write the whole thing down, I guess publish it just in time to be there for the Hillary Clinton transition team, maybe, which will have a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces. And I don't know. I just wanted to get it all sorted out of my mind. So you're the victims. You're the focus group. You're my collaborators, and I'm going to tell you what I think so far is the general outline of this book. What have I done to write the book? I have interviewed 48 people who were part of the decisions of the Obama administration between November of 2008 and March of 2009. I haven't interviewed President Obama, but I've interviewed almost everybody else you can think of. I interviewed Larry Summers 3 times. Not sure I've actually gotten all the truth out yet. And then I read a tremendous amount, and I thought about it a lot, and also I was there. Not in all the meetings, or even the majority of the meetings, but in a lot of really interesting meetings. So where to start? The thesis of the book is that President-elect Obama and President then Obama made 5 decisions, all of which were made between November of 2008 and March of 2009. And those 5 decisions were absolutely fateful for the American economy, the economy of all the Western nations, for his presidency. They're very significant for long after his presidency, and he's never been able to make any other decisions that were nearly as important as those 5 decisions. And that's because it's in the nature of anyone in any strategic position to find that the first decisions matter more than any subsequent decisions because they set the general direction. And it's also because at the particular time that Barack Obama was elected, the United States and the other Western economies were in an extremely critical position, and he had the single most important job in the entire world, and although his powers were very limited, he had more power than any other single person in the society. Does anyone think that those statements are preposterous? That he didn't have an important job, or there were other jobs that were more important? Does anyone want to disagree with that? Nobody? Or you haven't thought about it? Or you're not sure? Is there anybody in business that had a more important job? What about Jamie Dimon or somebody running some financial institution? How about Ben Bernanke, who was running the Federal Reserve? Was that more important than the president? Yes?
Well, for the 2009 period, I argue that the combination between Geithner and I forgot who his predecessor was on the Treasury side, but basically
Hank Paulson?
Paulson, yeah.
But Geithner worked for Obama.
That was he made TARP later, though, right? So the first crisis that had to be solved was kind of the short-term liquidity crunch in a way. So that's when Paulson pulled all the banks together.
Yeah.
Orchestrated a bunch of deals.
So you can make that argument. Now TARP, the law you're talking about, which gave the Treasury Department the money to in turn allow the Treasury Secretary, with the approval of President Bush, to inject that money. The reason TARP was passed is that Obama told the Democrats in Congress, even before the election, that they were going to vote for that. Famous meeting in the Oval Office. There were two meetings. One was in the Roosevelt Room of the White House in October. The election was in November. In October, when the Republican candidate, McCain, complained about TARP and said we shouldn't bail out the banks, and Obama said we had to, and he took over the whole meeting. President Bush watched him in awe, according to everyone, and basically Obama captivated the entire room. The Republicans refused to vote for TARP. The bill was actually initially defeated in Congress because the Republicans wouldn't vote for it. And Obama and Speaker Pelosi, who was running the House of Representatives, was a Democrat, and the majority leader on the Senate side, also Democrat, Harry Reid, they agreed to pass it and to allow the Treasury Department in the Bush administration to begin the bailout, but they didn't complete it. And it was Obama who decided that Geithner, who was running the New York Fed, would continue this program after the election. And Geithner and Paulson worked together, and then Paulson left in January, and Geithner came in. And so it was Obama who decided the Democrats would support it and it would be continuous. So I'm not saying that Paulson was irrelevant or unimportant, but I'm saying it was Obama who was actually steering the whole process. So that would be the way I would think about that. Bernanke played an absolutely critical role, but Bernanke, I remember seeing this in the White House mess in January. Bernanke would sit down with Larry Summers and they planned everything together. And Summers was working for Obama, and Obama was the, how should we say it? I wouldn't want to say mastermind, but he was the central figure in all of the decision making. As I said, curiously enough, even from before the election. So, I think that if you can't learn from what he did and the decisions he made in that experience, then what you'd have to say is, well, that situation was too dramatic, too important to teach us anything for lesser events. but it's the dramatic, really important things that are in all the case studies that you read, right? You don't have case studies about nothing events, right? So you want to look at the really big things, and there's not been anything bigger than this in my lifetime. And it's pretty hard in American history to find a president who came into a situation that was as dramatic as that. Abraham Lincoln walked into office in the middle of the secession of the southern states. That's 1861. Franklin Roosevelt came into office in March of 1933 in the middle of a banking crisis, but the Great Depression had already started 3.5 years earlier. Obama walked into office as the financial crisis was hitting its absolute peak, the worst possible condition, and before all of the effects of the financial crisis were felt in the economy at large. That is a really, really dramatic situation. So this is the graph about unemployment. The graph. So, like everybody is familiar, with this notion here that there's a natural rate of unemployment, NAIRU, which no economist can ever agree exactly what it is, but supposedly it's just what the economy must accept at any given moment as the natural rate of unemployment. If employment falls below this level, then supposedly that is going to lead to wage increases, and supposedly it's not sustainable. But those green numbers, they show the spikes in unemployment. And if you're in politics, there is a rule of thumb. This is true for all elections I've known about in the United States and every candidate in every place, and that is this. If in the country you're running for president and you're the incumbent and unemployment is 8% or higher, you're going to lose. And if it is below 8% and the trends are in the right direction, you're going to win. And 8% is the number. And if you're in the state of Pennsylvania and you're the incumbent senator, you're running statewide, and unemployment is higher than 8%, you're going to lose. 8% is the number. That might change, but that's been the number. Here's 8% for all the elections I know. And in this particular year, 1992, you see it was not quite 8%, but it was trending up. And that was the story of the Clinton candidacy. Unemployment is climbing, it's heading towards 8%, it's the economy, stupid was the motto. That was the basis of the campaign. It's how he won. He did not get 50% of the votes. There were three parties, three candidates, but he did win. And the success story of the Clinton administration is this curve. That's the success story. If he were here today, he would tell you in wonderful, colorful detail all of the reasons that this occurred. And I always say it's because the FCC did a really great job in kicking off the information sector boom, which accounted for actually this much right here is the number of jobs created just in the information sector. 2.1 million net new jobs, just thought I'd mention it. But whatever you do about the credit taking or the credit giving, you're going to have an economically successful presidency if this is the curve. But see, here's the thing with President Obama. He came in right about here. Not at this side of the curve, right about here. He was looking at the absolute certainty that the unemployment would rise at a prodigious level just as he was inaugurated. That there was no way in the world that he could stop that from happening. And that was the dramatic political nature of the situation. Meaning, how in the world was he ever going to have Congress stay Democratic 2 years later or get reelected in 2012? Or you could say, forget the politics, if his job is, and this is from Michael Porter's book, The Competitive Advantage of Nation, the right economic policy for any nation is to, economic policy for the national government is to try to create the conditions that will lead to a high and rising standard of living. If that's the right policy, then as the president, he was absolutely certain not to be able to deliver on that as of the time he came, because this number had begun to increase. And when we sat there in the meetings in October and November of 2008, and we looked at all that we could find by way of information, which wasn't very much, all the predictions were that it was absolutely certain that unemployment would hit 10%, which is what happened. Some people said it might hit 11 or 12, some people said maybe it'll be 9.8, but everybody knew that this was the curve. What nobody knew was whether it would ever come down or whether it would go really, really high and peak in a hurry and then drop in a hurry. That part was absolutely unknown. Okay, so strategy. You all taken strategy courses? You know, I was at McKinsey for 10 years. We used to charge a lot of money for the thing I'm now going to tell you in a really, really big hurry. All the books all say that there's just 3 parts to strategy, and no 2 books define the 3 parts the same way. But I'll give you the 3 definitions that work for me. Here's the first one: situation, complication, and resolution. That's the McKinsey framework: situation, complication, and resolution. And then there's Richard Rummelt. Do you know him? R-U-M-E-L-T, teaches at UCLA. Great strategy work. Wrote a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. Just read that book no matter what they assign you in the courses. That's a great book. He says that strategy is diagnosis, choice, and execution. And I would say that strategy consists of analysis, which is pretty similar to situation and pretty similar to diagnosis. And it consists, number 2, of creating an array of possible choices, which is very similar to his simple statement of choice. And then I would say that execution is a perfectly fine third thing. But here's the important thing about execution. This is also from Rummel. Execution is, choice, real choice, is the irrevocable commitment of capital to your choice. If it is not an irrevocable commitment of capital, then you haven't really made the choice. You've postponed making the choice. You've said, I'm going to do a little bit, but I haven't really decided. If you're the president, what is your capital? What is your capital? You got Larry Summers meeting with Ben Bernanke. You have TARP, which gave the Treasury $750 billion to spend. You have a majority in the House. You have a majority in the Senate. You have a tremendous high approval rating. I've just described all your capital. You actually have a lot of money. You can pass some things in Congress. You've got the American people wanting to support you because they just voted for you. One of the facts about elections is that if you win by 53% and then you do a poll 1 week later, you will find that the poll says that 60% of the people voted for you. It happens every single time. So you have this little time period in which the wind is behind you. You have the attention of the media, which doesn't happen very often. Very fractured media audience, but you have the attention for a while. All of that is your capital. So here's the problem. What was the situation? What was the analysis? I've described to you one part of the analysis, which is that it was absolutely certain that unemployment would go above 8%. But was that the only thing that needed knowing? You actually pointed out the other thing. Almost everybody who came into the transition team in October and November said that the number 1 thing was that every bank in the United States was at risk of failing, which is completely different than that point. Or is it? Okay, now we get to the debate that raged then and still rages to this moment about how should you diagnose an economic problem? These are the views. There is the view called fundamentals. Fundamentals means that an economic problem, let's say a recession, commences because there was some kind of shock. So when the Arab countries combined to create OPEC and raise collectively the prices of oil twice in the 1970s, that was a price shock to a fundamental commodity which kicked off 2 recessions and defined politics for a very, very long period of time. That's the fundamentals view. There was no such shock at this time. The second view about what accounts for a Great Recession is the behaviorist view, and it is that there was a asset price increase or some other trend driven by a kind of mob psychology or irrational expectations, and that view people use to describe the run-up in the stock market in 1999-2000. That run-up, the market peaking in the beginning of 2000, led to a fall down in those prices, and $5 trillion of asset value was lost in the stock market from 2000 to 2002. That's a very big number. Roughly speaking, that's about 40% of the annual GDP. That's a very big number. But that doesn't seem to account for what happened in 2008 or 2009 either. So fundamentals doesn't seem to work, and behavioral psychology doesn't seem to work. And the third diagnosis that was offered in this time period in October, November was that it was a bank lending problem. That's why Paulson wrote the TARP legislation, which he wrote on 2 pieces of paper. I remember this being, I remember us sitting in the transition team getting this, and we looked at it, and I said, and a bunch of other people said, he left out the possibility that the Treasury could buy equity in these companies. He didn't want to do that. Because, you know, because he had friends at Goldman Sachs? No, he thought that was too much intrusion. And then, you know, Barney Frank said, you have to put that in because we might want to buy equity, and then somebody else said, you have to put that in because you might want to invest in housing and you might want to take an equity position in housing. So they added a few words. They had the famous scene in the White House, and eventually it was passed. There's this one story where Paulson gets down on his knees to Nancy Pelosi, and Paulson says, I'm on my knees, I'm begging, and Nancy looks down at him and says, I didn't know you were a Catholic, Hank. It was very dramatic. It was very dramatic. But what was going on there is that Paulson and Geithner, and to some degree Summers, believed that the analysis of the problem is that it was a bank lending problem. And that if you could inject capital into the banks and they could keep lending, then you would be able to solve the recession in a hurry, and you could cut that green line off before it hit 10, or you could have it be very sharp and have it be a V-shaped recovery. So there's a book that I really recommend. You should not bother with my book. Maybe I'll never write it, but this book has been published, and you should absolutely read it if you really want to know anything. It's called The House of Debt. House of Debt. It's only 170 pages, not counting the footnote, and it is a great analysis. And I'm borrowing a lot from that book, and here's what they say. This problem was not properly diagnosed. Remember, step 1 is diagnosis. This problem was not properly diagnosed as a bank lending problem. It was not properly diagnosed as a shock. It was not properly diagnosed as behavioral psychology. The problem was a problem that predated the financial crisis of the fall of 2008, and it was extreme over-indebtedness by the American household. That was the fundamental problem. Some statistics. First of all, I showed you there that green line rising, but actually the job loss started to commence in 2007. between 2007 and 2009, 8 million jobs were lost in the United States. 8 million, roughly speaking, is the number that equals everything from that red line to the peak of that green line. So it's 8 million above the natural rate of unemployment. But in the previous 7 years to this job loss, in the period 2000 to 2007, household debt in the United States doubled to a total of $14 trillion, which is equal to the annual GDP. And think about it on an average basis. Roughly that means that every single household in the United States owed $140,000. Now you all graduating from grad school went like, yeah, so do I. and you do face a horrible debt burden, and I'm sorry that the system does that. But the economy imposed that burden on absolutely every single household on average in the entire United States. Or you could say all the individuals took it on themselves. Say it any way you want. That's the fact. That's the fact. And then the next thing that happens is, where is that debt secured? And the answer is it's secured by households. A lot of it is credit card debt, but overwhelmingly it's households. And so what it means, and roughly speaking, 2/3, 65% of all households own their own house in the United States. And in the time period 2000 to 2007, that number went from 65% to 69%, which is a small increase. But that increase of about 4 million people, absolutely every single person in that group was extremely over-leveraged. And so was everybody else too, on average. But particularly on the margin, extremely over-leveraged. And so these over-leveraged assets, they are all matched up against debt instruments, and I think you all know it's those debt instruments that end up being traded by the banks in 2008 and 2007, 8, and 9, and end up being the source of the financial crisis. So the authors of this book, Housing Debt, which I have over there, I better show you this book so you can have it. Show you that I didn't just make it up. Their point is, if you really want to look for cause, then you need to go back to the beginning of things, and then you need to meet Atif Mian and Amir Subi. You need to go back. One of them is at Chicago, and the other one is somewhere else. I hope it's not Harvard. Princeton. You need to go back and examine the root cause, because it's absolutely necessary when you're thinking of your choices to make sure that you're addressing the fundamental cause. Next point. I remember this discussion. I was in charge of going over to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae as part of the transition team and looking at all of their data, and the head of Fannie Mae explained, this is November of 2008, he explained the following. Housing prices have been declining for 2 years. They're going to continue to decline for the next 2 or 3 years. And as long as they're going down, two things will happen. More and more homeowner equity in houses will be erased. And as that continues to happen, there will be less and less and less consumer demand for anything. And here's the next point. Most of the housing price run-up, and therefore the housing price collapse, was concentrated in a fairly small number of states. Florida, California, not Texas, Maryland, Virginia, a few other places. But that didn't matter for the whole economy, because the collapse of this wealth would lead to a collapse in demand, and that in turn would cause firms that sell into those states to lay off people. So the contagion effect would be the unemployment that would spread from the fall in the house values and the wiping out of the equity. And so if you were in Kansas and you had never ever seen your house price go up, The effect for you of the house price collapse in California would be that you got laid off in Kansas anyhow because you were making a tradable product. 2/3, according to these guys, of all the job loss in the United States was loss of a tradable job. And when I say tradable here, I mean a job in Kansas that was in a business that was selling somewhere else in the United States. I mean tradable within the whole American economy. I don't mean tradable as to China or as to Europe. That's also true, but that's a different point. So non-tradable jobs, that might be jobs, they do the study here. There was some job loss in non-tradable jobs, but not nearly as much. But tradable jobs account for the overwhelming majority of the job loss. The problem politically is that if you're in Kansas, you don't know that that's what's happened to you. You know this. I didn't see any house price inflation, and I didn't buy the extra condo in Florida, and the guy that did that is the guy that ought to be suffering. But the problem is that his suffering leads to your suffering, and you need a collective solution to the problem. Okay, this is all situation. I could go on too long and we'll run out of time, so I'll have to say that we get to number 2 in the lesson, which is the fundamental trends really matter when you're analyzing the situation. Fundamental trends in the American economy in 2008 and 2009 included the following really interesting things that was extremely hard to fully appreciate, but one of them was that we were beginning to find out that the technique of fracking was going to cause a 80% drop in natural gas prices within the next couple of years. We also had the first intimations by early 2009 that fracking would also lead to tremendous discoveries of oil in the United States, which also would have an impact on the total, on the global oil price. And I talked to you earlier about shocks as a way to kick off a Great Recession. We knew by early 2009 that these would be positive shocks that would actually help the economy heal. And so one of the things that Barack Obama announced as his energy policy in early 2009 was the all of the above policy, which was designed to align the administration with these positive shocks. You have to not only diagnose the situation, but you have to try to get a sense of what the fundamental trends are, even when everything looks really awful. And then you have to figure out your strategy, and of course all of this is about strategy, but what I want to say here is that it really matters. So I talked to you a little bit about what the president's political capital is. This was the president in 1933. That's Franklin Roosevelt. That's at his inaugural address. At his inaugural address, he did the following 3 really big things. Thing number 1 is he decided to blame the 3 years of recession or depression that had already occurred on the malefactors of great wealth. He described to the American people the source of the depression as being generated by Wall Street. This was not completely accurate, but it was a very important strategic choice on his part. The second thing he did is he said that the government would play a very active role directly in getting people to work, and listed a long series of programs that would increase federal employment. At the time, the federal government was a very small part of the economy, and he was the first president in the history of the United States to describe the federal government as playing a big role in the economy. That's the second thing he did. And the third thing he did was this as a matter of rhetoric. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and the thing I want to say about this is he dedicated himself to finding a way to communicate to the American people that there was a we, and that we were all in it together. And the second thing he did is he decided from the inaugural address and thereafter that he would be an inspiring public leader. And he would say, you should have confidence that we will get through this. So this was a choice about who to blame the problem on, what would be the role of government, and what would be the rhetoric that would be used. And this is the next thing I want to say about the position of the president or any executive in any kind of crisis. You can only have one job, one. You can only pick one thing as the first thing you're doing. If you have limited capital, and everybody, and every president's, CEOs, startups, you have only so much capital, you need to dedicate irrevocably enough capital to your top priority to make sure you're going to win. This is what Obama did. This is the choice between healthcare reform and cap and trade and the clean energy legislation. And he had a meeting at the end of January with the leadership in the House, and they said to him that they wanted to do both, and he said this is number one. And he made an irrevocable commitment of capital to this. This did pass. He did not make an irrevocable commitment of capital to that, and that did not pass. There's a lot of complexity in both those stories, but his choice of job one was the number one reason why that passed and the other one did not. And then the necessary enemy. So I talked to you about Roosevelt to set this up. So Obama did not list a number of programs in which the federal government would put people to work. He did not do that. Federal government employment has declined consistently since 2009. State and local government employment declined. He did not do anything to increase, anything significant to increase state or local employment. There were campaigns against teachers and city municipal workers that were run by politicians who got elected in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and many other states. Obama did not do that because he did not think that the American people would support it. He thought that the era of big government was over. He thought that was not an option available to him. The second thing that he did not do is he did not identify Wall Street as the culprit. There were no criminal prosecutions. He picked Tim Geithner, who was from the New York Fed, to be the continuation of Hank Paulson. He helped pass the Paulson-written TARP legislation. He did not pick any particular group as the enemy. And as to the rhetoric, President Obama wanted to establish a certain kind of we. The we was he wanted to have Republicans and Democrats vote in common for his legislative agenda. He asked the Republican Senator of New Hampshire, Judd Gregg, to be the Commerce Secretary. Gregg turned him down. Mitch McConnell, who was the Republican leader in the Senate, said in January of 2009 that the primary job one for the Republican Party was to make sure that Obama was not reelected in 2012. Obama, in the face of all that, dedicated more than 14 months to trying to get even one Republican vote for his job one, which was the healthcare initiative. I'm not asking you to say that these were the right decisions or that they were wrong decisions. I'm just saying he had to make decisions of this particular kind. Now, if you agree with this book, then what you would say is that actually the diagnosis of the over-indebtedness linked to housing was never translated into a programmatic response. Everybody knew that housing was somehow at the root of the problem, but actually there was never any significant, concrete, important commitment of capital to addressing the housing situation. So President Obama then made 5 major decisions. Decision number 1 was the stimulus. He and Larry Summers and the rest did agree that the fall in demand described in this book was the fundamental reason for the Great Recession, and that the way to address it was to have a stimulus package, $1 billion stimulus package. The second big decision was to prioritize health care. The third big decision was to allow Congress to pass the cap and trade bill, which was an attempt to regulate the entire economy with a kind of permit system that effectively would resemble a carbon tax, but that was very clearly not intended to or likely in any way to stimulate economic growth. Big debate about whether it was going to do any harm, but it was never intended to do any good. Similarly, the healthcare legislation was never intended to stimulate the economy. So those are three decisions. The fourth decision was to not do anything significant about housing, and the fifth decision was to adopt the tone that I just described to you. He was going to be the post-partisan president, the bipartisan president. These were the five major decisions, and they all fit, I hope you would agree with me, into these strategic frameworks. There was an analysis, it was very solid, it was very, very thoughtful, it was very, very intense. There were a set of choices that were laid out. He made the choices I've described, and he made an irrevocable commitment of capital. As it turned out, the political capital that he had was just as short in duration as he thought that it would be. Meaning, it was even shorter because of the, I remember this, it was very painful, of the death of Senator Kennedy, which was a bad event if you, like me, were an admirer and acquaintance of Senator Kennedy, but it was also a really bad event politically because it cost Obama the vote in the Senate that would have permitted him to overcome the Republican opposition. And so and then Kennedy was replaced not by a Democrat, because Martha Coakley lost in the emergency election in Massachusetts, and instead Scott Brown, the model, won and forced Obama to a fairly desperate legislative solution, which finally was implemented in the spring of 2010. But the point is that the healthcare effort that I told you he made an irrevocable commitment of capital to turned out to use all the capital. And then, as that chart foreshadowed, even since 2008, the unemployment numbers doomed the Democratic Party in November of 2010. The amazing thing here is that President Obama was reelected in 2012. That's the amazing part of the story. So that's the way that I look back at this and fit it into the strategic framework. It kind of begs the question I haven't answered, which is, could he have done differently or should he have done differently? But I think, and this is my conclusion, because I'm really interested in stopping my talking and listening to you, I think that it's probably primarily important to try to figure out how things were decided instead of to criticize or applaud for what was done. Exactly how were things decided? Because that's what we all want to know in our own lives. If any of you gets to be the president or the advisor to the president, you're going to want to know how should things be decided. There you go.